Welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show today, my guest is an Australian son of a bus driver. He went into business at the age of 21 and today is a self-made millionaire. Entering politics, the combination of his salesmanship, marketing skill, leadership and shrewd business sense soon propelled him into the ministry. He was the member for Parliament in the Federal House of Representatives for 13 years, from 1977, and held various ministerial portfolios, including arts, sports, environment and territories. In 1986, he was named Australian of the Year by the Australian newspaper, and he was the founding chairman of the Tourism Task Force, now the Tourism and Transport Forum, and responsible for the Throw Another Shrimp on the Barbie tourism ad starring Paul Hogan, which contributed to an extraordinary jump in visitor numbers to Australia in the late 1980s. John Brown. Congratulations on your book. It's really, really fascinating. The Minister for Good Times. What a job title.
You didn't find it too bawdy?
No, I thought it was fantastic.
It's a very honest appraisal of a misused life.
John, let's start then right at the beginning. Tell us about your parents and your upbringing.
Well, my parents were very much working class. My mother was of very Irish extraction. My father had been Scottish. He was a Presbyterian. He turned to Catholic for my mother. And I had a wonderful life through the Depression. You know, my father was out of work when I was born. He was on the dole. And then we had 5 kids, and life was very difficult. Not just for us, but for the whole population of Australia at that stage, because money was very scarce, joy was pretty absent as well, and we were just coming out of the Depression. So it was well into the 30s. I was born 31. Was well into the 30s, say about 33 or 34, before my father had work. He was allowed to buy a house because he was a returned soldier from the First World War. Could you imagine your father going to war on a horse? Mine did, in the light horse. That's how old I am. But then life became a lot easier, of course. My father was very much a handy man. We got a tiny little house, and he turned into a more than tiny little house. We lived very comfortably, but like everybody else, we had very little ambition, very little desire. You just had what you had, and you enjoyed it.
You were very good at sport. You played a lot of tennis, you played football, you saved up to buy your first football. You were also the first person in your family to go to university. And you say that you regret what you chose to study. Why was that?
Well, I wasn't only the first person to go to university. I was the first person in a family of some 40 or 50 people that ever did the high school certificate at school. And I only went there because I won bursaries. Then I had the choice of 5 bursaries to go to university. My family had always been from the bush, not my particular family, but all the rest of them, all my father's family and all my mother's family were in the bush, all farmers. I loved growing things, as did my father. So I chose to do agriculture, which was a very bad choice because I was the only city kid in the faculty. All the other kids had done their early schooling at the agricultural schools in the bush. I knew nothing about biology, zoology, or any of those subjects. They were absolutely foreign to me. So I played pretty good football in first year university, and I lost the bursary. So I went back and repeated the next year, part-time, while working in all sorts of jobs to sustain myself. So university wasn't a very happy time for me. I felt out of place there. I went to a brother's school, and what we were taught was how to pass exams. We weren't taught anything to stimulate your mind at all. To think, to philosophise was absent from my schooling. So I felt very much out of place at the university. I wasn't sorry to leave.
How did you get into the meat trade?
Well, if you've read the book, you read that I ran away to the bush for 6 months after a girlfriend I had died very suddenly. And when I came back for my 21st birthday, a friend of mine was in the meat industry, and he sort of encouraged me to go there, so I finished up with a big company as a cattle buyer, and that was it. I was there for the next 30-odd years.
You also became very involved with the unions and, of course, with the Labour Party too. This was really the birth of your political career. Tell us more.
Well, my father was very much a union man. In fact, he became the president of the Bus Employees Union for 20 years. Wouldn't take his promotions. He stayed where he was. He still wanted to be a bus driver, so he's still with the workers. And, of course, I inherited a lot of my political views from my father. Nothing controversial, nothing. All I wanted to do was help people. That's what my father wanted to do. We want to see much more equality in the community than there was. You know, I still can't embrace the idea of people living in Sydney with a $100 million house, 3 or 4 huge cars in the garage, and other people are battling to put money on the table. There's something basically wrong with the tax system. So that was the basis of my politics. But even then, when I was in the meat industry, I finished up with a very big, strong business of my own from nothing, and I was a member of the workers' union, the meat workers' union, but I was also chairman of the employers' group, which was a bit odd, I know, because when I went to the parliament, I think I was the first one ever entered the parliament with those two notches on my barrel, chairman of the employers' group, while still a member of the union. And I felt no discomfort in any way, and the two bodies both gave me references when I went for pre-selection. So,
tell us then about that transition into full-time politics.
Well, I had to give away a business for a start. I mean, people think that politicians live a life of ease and money. They don't. It cost me many millions to be a member of parliament because the person that I left in charge of the company very soon found a way to make himself rich and me poor. But I didn't care. It didn't matter to me. And as a part of that deal, I was robbed by a couple of other people. I learned very, very quickly that handshakes don't mean much. You've got to have written things. So, although it cost me many millions, I don't care. I look in the mirror and I see an honest man.
I want to look now at your time as Minister for Sport, because it was a very important time. We saw an Olympic bid at that time, and you were very much involved in that. Tell us more.
Well, in the early 80s, I was the Shadow Minister for Sport, but the government didn't do anything about sport. I mentioned in the book that from Federation in 1900 till 1983, when Bob Hawke became the Prime Minister, the word sport never featured in one piece of legislation in those 80-odd years. So the government did nothing about sport. And my previous leader said sport and tourism have no political value whatever, so I wasn't even allowed to talk about it. When Bob Hawke arrived, like me, a sports nut. So immediately we started getting the government involved, not on a financial basis, but on a moral basis in sport. A good example, the sports budget when I got there was $6 million in 1983. In 1984, when Bob became the Prime Minister, I got $75 million to build the Institute of Sport, which inspired even the Poms. Sebastian Coe came out and spent a week here. He couldn't believe it, how good it was. It was the best in the world. And we did a lot of other things as well, a cricket academy and a squash academy and an academy for all different areas of sport. And sport suddenly took on an impetus in Australia that it never had. We became the envy of the world, I think, because Samaranch came out and the American Institute of Sport, they come out here and gave me a decoration. So that's how sport started. Bob and I were both very enthusiastic. And commercially as well. I mean, when we took away from race clubs, dogs, trots and gallops, like, you probably don't realise this in England, but we've got more race courses in Australia than any country in the world. Dogs, trots and gallops in every little country town has a racetrack. So until 1984, racetracks had always paid income tax. Then we took away from race clubs and the desire to pay, or need to pay, income tax. And racing has just gone whooshka since then. All those little country towns now have a nice racetrack instead of an old broken down thing. And the race club becomes a social identity in all those country towns. It runs everything.
Why do you think that sport is so important to Australians? Because it does seem that it plays an enormous part in the national psyche.
Well, it does, but even before it was even recognised by government, it played an important part. All of our heroes in Australia are sportsmen and women. They're not generals, they're not colonels, they're not explorers, they're sportsmen and women. In fact, you'd even find a horse in the 10 most favoured Australians. So we needed to give them a chance. For instance, our Olympic team, up until 1984, the kids had to buy their own uniforms, pay their own fare. It was only in 1984 when they went to Los Angeles. That was all provided for them. Now, until then, our Olympic record was pretty low. We didn't win a medal in 76. We went to Moscow in 80, and they won 2 on the last day, which was good, because the Labor Party had to fight the then in government, which was the Liberals. In order to get to Moscow, they wanted to boycott. I'm glad we went, because that's allowed us to maintain our record in Australia of being the only country apart from Greece that's been to every modern Olympic. So anyhow, sport kicks on from the 80s and 90s. We had a golden period in sport. We won everything. It wasn't just Olympics. It was cricket. It was football. It was women's sport, particularly. Our women swimmers were the best in the world and still are. Now, all that happened because we suddenly started to promote it, gave them a chance.
And got the money in, of course. Now, during this time, you got married, you had 5 children. You were talking about horses. Of course, we know that there was a horse at one point called Sex on the Desk. And you do start the book by talking about the scandals surrounding your wife. And I wondered, you deal with it very well. And I must say that I was so impressed by the way you talk about your wife or your ex-wife throughout the book, because you have reason to be very angry, but you're extremely generous. And I wondered if you'd just talk us through that slightly.
I'm not an angry person, except with people who rob me. I dislike them intensely, but nobody else. So I just love everybody. And she was entitled to be treated well. I mean, she had pretty bad intentions when she gave that story out. She thought it would do me some harm, but it didn't. My good humour made it a big positive. So men used to come to me and say, "My wife's cranky." He said, "Why don't we get something happening on the desk, something a bit original, been enthusiastic?"
Why do you think she went to the press with that story, that is in fact what had happened?
She loves a headline. She had a very, very good public affairs company. Very clever. She was really good at it. And she loved a headline, and that provided a nice headliner. Do you know that was the biggest 60 Minutes audience ever in Australia's history? And it was over a man with his wife. Just shows you about the voyeuristic nature of society. They thought it was something bad. I mean, even the Catholic Church approved it.
I guess having sex with your wife on the office desk is fine, as long as you are in fact married to her.
Well, as long as it's your wife, yes. I mean, that was the drama. If it had been someone else, it would have been something to scream about.
Another bit of scandal, and this is a story I love, is about you and koalas.
Oh, yes.
Tell us what you call koala bears.
Well, I was at this is before I had Americans coming here in big numbers, and someone asked me about koalas. I said, but they're dirty, stinging, evil little things. They'll scratch you and they hate being cuddled, and when you pick them up, they want to piddle on you. That's their defence mechanism. And it's exactly correct. Now, I became the patron of the Koala Foundation for 20 years after that, because suddenly they had prominence. People realised we had this exotic little marsupial in Australia.
I want to come now to tourism because you have not only, I think, reinvented tourism for Australia, I think that you've given the world a lesson in how to brand a country. And I'm really interested in drilling down into how you did that.
Well, Paul Hogan was a friend of mine. He was a comedian here at the time. He was Australia's leading comic, a big star on television. He went to Disneyland in California, the same as I did, different times. And we saw how Australia was denied any reference at all. You go through the thing called It's a Small World. All the children of the world are arrayed in their national costumes. Very easy to indicate, to see the Poms, the Scots, the Britons, the Irish, the Germans, everyone. I'm thinking, I wonder how we're going to display Australia. Well, we did. A plastic koala and a plastic kangaroo. It was demeaning. It was embarrassing. So Paul and I put our heads together and we said, we've got to give Australia an identity. Why are we the best secret in the world down here in the South Pacific? We've got so much to offer. 37,000 kilometres of coastline. Apart from Canada, it's the biggest coastline in the world. And all pure. None of it polluted. None of it corrupted. You know, why don't we tell people we've got more snowfields than Switzerland? And the other thing I didn't do at the time, but I've worried about it since. Every night on CNN, on American television, they show the air quality. Now, everywhere, say China, Japan, India, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, 4 and 5, bad. Come to Australia, ones. We've got the cleanest, purest air in the world, and we're lucky to have it. Why aren't we using that as a call sign? So then I found the money, trickily, you've read in the book how I got the money through the Expenditure Review Committee, sent Paul to America. We only had $15 million, which gave us very little time on American television. But this is when he did Shrimp on the Barbie, which has become part of the American dog rule. And people fell in love with it that much that the advertising, the television stations gave us 6 weeks for nothing because every advertiser wanted to be on the same program as Shrimp on the Barbie. Well, then people started coming here in their thousands to Sydney, but we didn't have a tourism industry as such. And when they started coming to Sydney, where were we going to put them? We hadn't built a hotel in Sydney in 40 years, not a one. All our hotels were old fossils. So I went to Bob Hawke. I'd been to the hotel industry. Oh, no, we can't stack them up financially. We can't build it. I said to Bob, we're going to do something about this. He went to the taxation department and the government. Of course, he was very powerful Prime Minister then. He said, look, every commercial building's got 2.5% depreciation. I want 4% for tourism. Write it off in 25 years. Well, it's unbelievable. It was a sort of transaction of immense proportions. In 2 years, we had 20 brand new hotels in Sydney. Brand new ones, beautiful ones. And suddenly we're in the tourism industry. But if you read in the book all the things I had to do, like with travel agents and everybody else, to make sure it was an industry. And pleased to say that now it's the biggest industry in Australia. It's the biggest employer. From nothing. Just from Bob and I sending him to America and then getting 4% depreciation. And that didn't work here. That worked everywhere because you've read in the book when I went to Japan. And they weren't coming here at all. But when they heard there was 4% depreciation, down they came. All those golf courses in Queensland, there are dozens of beautiful places. They built them. They built hotels in Sydney. They built resorts all over Australia.
You seem to have had a lot of fun the whole way through, and in fact, the book is it's called Brownie, but it's subtitled "The Minister for Good Times," and part of that was some of the extraordinary people that you got to meet, and one of those people was Pele. Tell us about him.
Well, Pele came to Sydney. A friend of mine had produced a thing called the Pele Albums, and we had a big dinner in Sydney. I was asked to be the guest speaker. So I sat alongside Pele for about 2 hours, in which time he regaled me about his youth in Brazil, all the work he was doing for charity, because from being a minor player in Brazil, the only black man in a white Brazilian team that won the World Cup 3 times, he became the best player in the world and put upon by everybody. He had more injuries than anybody because he was so good. So we talked about it for a long time, and it inspired me to do a lot of things that I do. And then I hadn't seen him for a long time. Oh, that night he told me, he said, my ambition is to become the Minister for Sport in Brazil. Although he didn't live there, he lived in America. So the next time I bumped him was at the World Cup some years later, when he was, because he's a star of the World Cup, he is the big star. So I bumped into him that night, unexpectedly. He saw me in the crowd and he rushed up and put his arms around me. I said, God, Pele, it's a miracle. He said, my friend, I am now the Minister for Sport in Brazil. So that was a wonderful meeting with him. And others I met, of course, Muhammad Ali and some others. I didn't meet Taylor Swift. I was too early for her.
Well, let's talk about Taylor Swift because, of course, she has...
Bing Crosby was more my stuff.
She, at the time that we're conducting this interview, is in fact in Australia. Hundreds of millions of dollars have flown through the Australian economy because she came to Sydney and came to Melbourne.
She came here? Because since the 1980s, we've got places where we could put her on. We didn't have those stadiums before. We didn't have those areas where you can put 100,000 people or 80 or 60,000 people for her to have a concert.
You built those stadiums, and Taylor Swift coming here is actually not that unusual because when you look back at the history of popular culture within Australia, we see things like ABBA, for instance, coming here and having the venues and causing exactly this kind of mass hysteria. I mean, can you remember anything like this phenomenon before?
No, it didn't exist before. It didn't exist. I mean, when I built Parramatta Stadium, which has now been replaced by a much better one, way back in 1986, it was the first sporting venue built in Sydney in a century. The only thing that had been built before was the North Sydney Olympic Pool, which is now being rebuilt, which was built for the 1936 Empire Games. We had nothing.
Tell me why you resigned.
Why did I resign? Someone accused me of misleading the Parliament. Now, I've never told a lie in my life, so I got pretty offended by it. The Prime Minister rang me the day. He said, withdraw that thing. He said, I've checked the budget papers. Everything you said in the House was absolutely in accord with the budget decisions. But there was someone below me, a junior minister, who was organising a coup for himself. He put out a letter in the press, which was erroneous. It was out of date. It was before I got it changed. So this was December. The Parliament didn't meet again till March. Now, it was very difficult to defend yourself in the press. All I had to do was go into the Parliament and say, here are the budget papers. What I've said is exactly in accord with budget decisions. The Prime Minister never forgave me for resigning. He tried months later to get me to go back. But by then I'd had enough. I'd done what I wanted to do. We've got sport and tourism up and running in a big way. And I felt quite happy to walk away.
When you look back at your career, what stands out most to you?
What stands out most for me is the number of kids that have got employment. Here's one sitting down here, Zoe. The Australian Tourist Commission was a pretty moribund body, if you read in the book. Very moribund, till I moved them to Sydney, sacked the board, got a new board, got them a budget that they could work with, and of course they've done wonderful work since. But I must say, since the 80s, governments of both political parties have lost the plot. They haven't pushed for sport, they haven't pushed for tourism. It's just happened because there were entrepreneurs there that when I changed the rules and allowed them to do things, they did it, not with much government help. So it's only since the recent Albanese government that I've been able to get to the Prime Minister and get things done. For instance, the Institute of Sport in Canberra that I built when it was the best in the world has deteriorated since, because every state said, oh, a lot of money, a lot of votes in sport, so they all built one. So now the games are coming into Brisbane. They tried to move the Institute of Sport in Canberra to Brisbane, But I've had a long talk with the Prime Minister about it. They've just found $200 million to refurbish it because it's 40 years old. It needs doing up again, and it'll become the centre of sporting administration in Australia once again. So that's good. But the greatest thrill I've had is find those millions of kids like Zoe that have got jobs in tourism. Plus the fact that we're suddenly proud of ourselves. I mean, while we were hiding behind God knows why in all those years up until the 80s, no one knew about us. Anita Hogan to go and say, put a shrimp on the barbie. They suddenly realised it's a pretty interesting country down there in the south, and they've been streaming here ever since.
Tell me about writing the book. What made you do it at this stage, and how difficult was it?
I'll tell you why. My mother and father are beautiful people. I knew nothing about their youth, whatever. One of my regrets is I didn't put a tape. I didn't even know where they went to school. Knew nothing about them. I know tributes about them. You know, my father came from Glen Innes, totally Presbyterian town, Scottish town. He married an Irish girl. I've only found out recently. My father's mother was very Irish, from a very Irish family, but she turned to Presbyterian to marry my father. It's only since my son has been doing history of the family I've found out what happened. As soon as she died, Catholicity disappeared. I had no idea. I had Catholic relations all over Australia, no idea, because suddenly Presbyterian, my father was Presbyterian, then married my mother as a Catholic. So I knew nothing about them. I didn't want to die with my children knowing nothing about me. So that's why I wrote my memoirs in the first place, which was pretty accurate description with my four sisters living in not poverty, it was genteel poverty, you'd have to say. You know, my parents were not educated really, but very cultured people. And I liked the way they evolved from their very basic youth. My father, second youngest of 9 children in a working class town in Glen Innes. My mother, about number 5 in a family of 9 Catholic kids in Maxwell. I didn't even know where they went to school. I have no idea. I know my mother was very cultured. She taught me to write, taught me to read. But I really want to know how this has evolved in them, and I couldn't find out because my father died not long after. My mother died when I was just 30. So I sat down and I wrote my own. I wanted my kids to know where I came from, and I sketched as best I could what I knew of my parents. So this book evolved from my... And then the other reason I wanted to write the book, Bob Hawke is things about him people don't know. You know, until he came to the Prime Ministership in 1984, sport and tourism didn't exist. It was only my sort of inspiration and Bob's ability to get things done that were able to do those things. And that part of Bob's not all that well known. I mean, there's another thing in there that I wrote. People don't realise that he organised the worldwide moratorium on exploration for oil and minerals in the Antarctic. The Antarctic is the only continent in the world where there's no exploration for those sorts of things. Now, he set that up. 50 years, it's due in about another 10 years it will expire. I hope there's another Bob Hawke around who can get all the countries of the world to agree on that. So that's another reason I wrote it. Plus another thing about it was Bob's hate of apartheid, as I did. Well, you read the piece about his little foray with Margaret Thatcher. Well, that did good. The Commonwealth Games would have expired in 1986 in Edinburgh. That would have been the last one. And I think I'm right. The only thing that keeps the Commonwealth together as a group of nations is sport. There's nothing else they've got in common. They're political divisions, religious divisions, social divisions, but they all love sport. Whether it will exist again now, and it keeps existing, but at least from 1986 it existed till now. And I think that was important. But it was Bob's hate of apartheid, because he'd met Mandela back in 1960 when he was a kid. He was a a Rhodes Scholar in Africa, and he went to visit Mandela in jail way back in 1960, and he maintained that relationship with him right through till he became Prime Minister, until they both became Prime Minister. So I think that needed to be told, that story. I'd never told anybody. I was the only witness to it, and I hadn't told a soul, not even my colleagues, until I wrote in the book. And I think it was worth telling.
The whole story is worth telling. It's an absolutely fascinating life, and you've achieved so much for sport, for tourism, and really on pure entertainment value, because I thought it was just a jolly good read. So, John Brown, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
John Brown's book, Brownie, The Minister for Good Times, is available now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers on Monocle Radio. This edition was recorded in Sydney, Australia. Many thanks to my producer, Tamsin Howard. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.